We're on the very first line of DAF Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, and the Gemara is at a point where there's a discussion between Rabbi Avohu and Rabbi Menachem as far as whether or not we paskin that the halacha is always like a stam mishnah, like an anonymous mishnah. And it seems like the consensus is, yes, we always paskin like a stam mishnah. When there's no authorship to the mishnah, that's always the halacha. And so, in the midst of this discussion, Rabbi Menachem asked Rabbi Avohu the following question: Amar lei v'hatnan. Look at the following mishnah, Maseches Kelim, and you'll see that this is a stam mishnah, and it seems we don't paskin that way. The Mishnah talks about Masrek shel Pishtan shenitlu shinav v'nishtayru bo shtayim. Now, in order for a kli to no longer be makabel tuma, it has to be no longer usable. So, a comb that is used to comb raw material to turn it into fabric thread is a very important tool in the manufacturing process. But let's say the teeth of the comb are removed. So it's no longer usable. So it's not a kli anymore. It's not makabel tum anymore. But let's say you have two teeth that are remaining in the comb. So if it's a flax comb, it's a comb that's used for combing flax. Thank you so much. As long as you have two teeth remaining in the comb, thank you. Then it's still makabel tuma. The echas tahor. But if there's only one tooth left, then it's not really usable, and so therefore it's tahor. The kulan shenidlu echas bifnei atzman timeos. And furthermore, says the Mishnah, that the teeth themselves that are pulled out of the comb are able to be used as individual kalim, as the Mishnah will discuss, and therefore they also are makabel tuma. And if they already were tameh, they retain their status of tuma. Now that's talking about a flax comb. Shel tzemer, a wool comb, needs greater accuracy in order for it to be able to comb the material properly, and therefore shenitlu shinav echos mi bein tayim tohar, that if every other tooth is removed, so you can have multiple teeth that are still left in the comb, but as long as there's a space of one tooth missing between each of the teeth, it's no longer usable, because you need to have much closer teeth on a wool comb in order for it to be effective. And so therefore it's no longer makabel tuma. Nishtayru bo gimel b'makom echad tameh. If, however, you have three teeth adjacent to each other, even if you don't have any other teeth in the comb, so then it's going to be tameh. Haisa hachitzona echas mehen tohar. If the three teeth that we said you need to be adjacent to each other in order to still be a kli, if one of those teeth was the outer tooth, so then it's tohar. Now understand, just imagine a 50-cent comb, right? That you used to comb your hair. The outer part does not have a regular thin tooth. It's got a thick border, right? So if that thick border tooth is one of the three teeth, that doesn't count. It's still going to be tohar, because you can't comb the wool with that thick tooth. It doesn't work. Okay. So nitlu beis v'asan lamalaket temeos echas v'skina laner olomituach temeya. And then it says, as far as the individual teeth of the comb that are removed from the comb, if you take two of them and I guess they're still connected at the bottom, and use it like chopsticks or like a tongs, so then those two teeth are makabel tuma. Or if you use the individual teeth as if it's fixed in some way, if you whittle it or sand it down in some way so that you can use it as a candle fixer, meaning that you would use to remove the wicks out of the candle, you'd use like a toothpick. Or you would use it like a pin to stretch fabric out on a board, so then it's also a kli, and therefore it's tummy. Now, the kaimel andein halacha kosa mishnah. So Rabbi Menachem asked Rabbi Avohu, he says, we paskin not like that mishnah. We have a tradition that the halacha is not like that mishnah. That's a stam mishnah, so how can you say we don't go like that? So Amar lei bar mina. So Rabbi Avohu responds to him and he says, that mishnah is an exception to the general rule. Dehahi de Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish Amar to Ravayu Zu Eina Mishnah, because both Rabbi Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan both said this is not a valid Mishnah. Now, what does it mean it's not a valid Mishnah? We know that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is the redactor of all of the Mishnayos. So either they're saying that some corrupted text got incorporated in the Mishnayos, or they're saying that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, it had a bad day, when he, whatever it is. In other words, they're saying that this is a corrupted text. It's not a correct text. And so the question is, how do you know that this is a corrupted text? My time, Amar Rav Huna bar Menachem Shmei de Ravi de Berei de Ravika Mishum de Kasher Reisha L'Seifa, because there's an inherent contradiction within the text. The Katani Shel Tzemer Shenit Lushina of Echas Mi Bein Tayim Tahor, because when we talked about that comb that's used for combing wool, we said that if even just one tooth is removed from every other tooth, so that you have one tooth space between each tooth, that makes it puzzle and it's no longer usable, and therefore it's tar. By implication, as long as you have two teeth adjacent to each other, so then it's usable as a kli, and it's tameh. So v'hadertzini nishtayr bo gimel tameh, gimel in shtaim lo. But then it says in the very next line that you have to have three teeth of the comb adjacent to each other, only three, but not two. So there's an inherent stira, an inherent contradiction within the language of the Mishnah, and that shows us that it's a corrupted text. So frek the Gemara, my kushya, dilma ha begaviasa ha beberaisa, that maybe there's two different kinds of teeth in the comb. Rashi explains that there's two different rows of teeth, or two different sections of the comb. And I'm not really exactly sure how to describe it, but each comb, we're not talking about a hand comb that used to comb your hair. We're talking about a very large comb that's used to comb fabric. So you have the area that's right by the handle of the comb where you hold your hand, which is in the center. Those teeth are much more effective. And therefore, perhaps, when it comes to those teeth, because you have much more leverage of and maneuverability of those teeth, then maybe that's the part of the Mishnah that says that as long as you have two adjacent to each other, they're still usable for combing. But the areas, the parts of the teeth of the comb that are further away from the center, that are not as effective because you don't have the same leverage of use with those teeth, maybe that's where you need to have three adjacent to each other. So it's not necessarily a contradiction. Ela mehacha, but rather we can learn the fact that this is a corrupted text from here. The Katani v'kulan shenitlu echas b'fnei atzman temeas, because it says that if the first part, when we were talking about the flax comb, it said that as long as the tooth was pulled out, it can be used, and it's as a kli, and therefore it's tameh. V'afal gav delo hiskina, and that's true even if you did nothing to further manufacture that tooth, to sand it down, to whittle it down, or anything, or to add anything to it. But ema seifa, echas v'hiskina l'ner l'mituach tameya, hiskina in lo hiskina lo. Second part of that Mishnah talks about the wool comb, and it says that if a tooth comes out of the wool comb and you do something to rectify it, maybe to add a little base to it, or to sand it in some way, to whittle it in some way, only then is it considered a kli, as far as using it as a tongs, or using it as a wick remover, or a pin. So which one is it? Is it a tooth that is not hand processed at all, or is it a tooth that is processed? That's the stira. Amar Abayu my kushya, dilma habik hasayu habelo kasayu. So Abayu says, but that too is not a contradiction. We're talking about wooden combs. And sometimes when you pull out a piece of wood from a comb structure, sometimes a portion of the base of the comb, like a little shtickle, comes out with the tooth on the bottom also. That's the kind of tooth that doesn't need to have any further processing because it's already got a little handle at the base. But the tooth that is discussed in the Seifa for the wool comb is talking about a tooth that comes out without any base to it, without any additional pieces of wood to it. So that's why it's not a contradiction. Amar Rav Papa umay kushya v'dilma ha bekatinta ha be'alimta. Rav Papa says further it's not a stira, because I could tell you there's two different sizes of comb teeth. One comb has much larger and wider teeth, and therefore it doesn't need any modification or rectification because it's big enough to hold on its own. But when you're dealing with a very, very narrow, very small tooth, then you need to add some kind of base to it in order to have a handle on it. Ella, so rather, what's the reason why this Mishnah is not usable as a Stam Mishnah? Not because of a corrupted text, you're right. Ella mishum demesaini ba davkani zudiver Reb Shimon. But rather because the people who have a more exact text of this Mishnah have one last line to this Mishnah that says, Zu divrei Reb Shimon. This is not a Stam Mishnah, this is the opinion of Reb Shimon. And that's the reason why we don't paskin like it, because it's taka not a Stam Mishnah. Okay. Sholach Reb Chia bar Abin. So now that we've discussed our halacha in Maseches Kelim, let's now talk about, let's go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah was talking about marrying a woman who's divorced or widowed within 3 months. And we saw a machloikas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanakama says that you have to wait a full 3 months before you're allowed to remarry. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you're allowed to have erisin within the 3 months, as long as it's not nisuin. Because the purpose of waiting 3 months is for the purpose of havchana. Remember we talked about that term? Havchana is to make sure. You want to know if the woman gives birth after 7 months, you want to know who's the father. So therefore you have to wait. You have to wait 3 months so that you'll know for sure that if she gives birth, it'll be 6 months later, then you know it's from the first father. If it's longer than that, so then you know that it's from the second husband. So that's the reason why you have to wait. And the question is, how do we paskin? Do we paskin like the Chachamim, who say that no matter what, you always have to wait 3 months, even if it's only to get erisin from the new husband? Or do we say that no, since the whole concern is because of havchana, the only thing that you're not allowed to do is nisuin, but you can do erisin because there's no consummation there. And so therefore that's the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara now comes back to that and it says, Sholach Reb Chia bar Abin ma'arsin toch gimel v'chein oisin ma'isa. That Reb Chia says that we do allow women to have erisin within the 3 months, and I've actually seen cases like that, he says. V'chein hoya Rabbi Elazar melamdenu mishum Rabbi Chanina hagadol rubo shel rishon rubo shel shlishi ve'emtzoi sholem. And he doesn't say unqualified that you're allowed to have erisin within the 3 months. That Rabbi Elazar taught us that what you're allowed to do is you have the whole middle month and the majority of the first month and the majority of the third month, which means that you only need to have a little bit more than 2 months. You don't need a full 3 months in order for a woman to have erisin. Ameimar shara li ares biyom tishon. Ameimar had a kula. He wasn't prepared to be makel that much. But Ameimar gave a heter for a woman to receive erisin on day 90, meaning the last day. He said you don't have to wait until day 91, the day after the 3 months. He says, okay, we'll give you a heter to do it 1 day earlier because it's only erisin. So Amalei Ravashi la Ameimar v'haravu Shmuel damri to Ravayo tzrich lahamtin gimel chadashim chutz miyom shemesbo v'chutz miyom shenis arsavo. He says, but wait a minute, Rav and Shmuel both say that you have to wait the full period of time, not counting the day of death and not counting the final 90th day. So what right do you have to have erisin on the 90th day? So hahu le'inyan menekes itmar. No, you're misquoting it. Rav and Shmuel were not talking about the 3-month waiting period. They were talking about the 24-month waiting period. That if you want to marry a woman who's pregnant, not only do you have to wait until she gives birth, but you also have to wait 24 months after she gives birth. And the reason is, as we mentioned before, is that we're concerned that the new husband will impregnate her. Her milk will therefore go bad for the baby that she's been nursing. A baby needs 2 years of milk, typically, in order for him to be healthy. And the husband's not going to want to pay for the baby formula. So therefore, we, out of concern for the newborn child from her first husband, we require a 24-month period. And on that, Rav and Shmuel said, Damri Turavayu tzrich lahamtin chafdal chodesh chutz miyom shenolad bo v'chutz miyom shenis arsabo. That even if she only wants to get erisin from her new husband, she has to wait a full 24 months, not counting the day of death and not counting the day of betrothal. So the Gemara now says, V'hahahu da'abat sudas erisin b'yom tishim va'afsadei rava l'su'udase. But if you're telling me that it is okay to get betrothed on the 90th day, why then did Rava penalize a person who made a chasana, an erisin meal, an erisin festive meal on day 90? And Rava said, can't use it. You got to pay the caterer, but you got to throw away all the food because he wouldn't allow him to do it. So the Gemara says, "Hahi sudas nisuin havai," but that's not a raya. That you got your story wrong. That wasn't an erisin suda. That was an asuin suda, and that's why Rava penalized the guy, because you jumped the gun one day early. And v'hilchas tzricha lahamtin chavdal chodesh chutz miyom shenolad bo v'chutz miyom shenis arsabo. But the final psak says the Gemara is to be machmir, both for the 24-month waiting period for a nursing mother and for the 3-month waiting period to determine if a woman is pregnant, requires you to wait the full amount, not counting the day of death and not counting the day of erisin as the 24 months of the 3 months. Let us go weiter. Now we're going to take a look at the shita, the third shita of our Mishnah, which was the shita of Rabbi Yossi. Now Rabbi Yossi had taught us, remember, Rabbi Yehuda is lenient in both areas. He says that if a woman only had erisin in her first marriage, she's allowed to have nesuin right away. And if a woman only had nesuin in her first marriage, she's allowed to have erisin right away. The only thing she's not allowed to have is nesuin after nesuin within 3 months. Comes along Rabbi Yossi and says, and this is the way Rashi learns Rabbi Yossi, he says, I agree with Rabbi Yehuda that a woman is allowed to get erisin immediately after nisuin, except in the case where she's a widow, where her first husband died and not she was divorced. Because in that situation, she's got shloshim, she's got avelus, and we don't allow her to have simcha of erisin during her avelus. So Amar Reb Chisda, so comes along Reb Chisda and he says as follows. He says, Kal v'chomer, Uma b'makam sh'asu l'chabes muta li'ares, makam shemuta l'chabes eno din shemuta li'ares! Exclamation point. Reb Chisda is asking a kasha on Rabbi Yossi. He says, I don't understand Rabbi Yossi. He says, I'm about to show you a case where the avelus is so strong that you're not even allowed to do the laundry. And yet, we still allow a woman to accept erisin. So surely in a situation like shloshim, where you're allowed to do the laundry, surely you should be allowed to accept erisin. So if Rabbi Yossi's whole concern is not accepting erisin during shloshim, why not? What's the big deal? So what is he referring to? Mahi ditnan, because this is the Mishnah Maseches Tainis, which talks about the laws of the 9 days, and it says Shabbos shechal Tisha B'av b'soicha. Now here it's talking about the week that Tisha B'av falls out, because the Mishnah talks about there's a heightened level of mourning in the week that Tisha B'av falls out. So the 9 days may begin from the previous week, but Shavua Shechal Bo is even more machmir. And during that week, the Mishnah says, Asur l'saper u'lechabes, that you're not allowed to get haircuts, you're not allowed to do the laundry. Uvachamishi muter mipnei kavod Shabbos. And except for the Thursday before Shabbos, where you're allowed to get a haircut and do laundry out of kavod Shabbos. Vitanya. And the Brisa on that says, Kodem azman hazeh ha'amimatin bi'iskehem milisa umilitein milivnos v'lintoa uma'arsin avalo konsin. That before Tisha B'av, that's what Kodem azman hazeh at least means in the Havamina, people have to minimize their amount of labor, their amount of business activity, building, planting, but they still are allowed to accept erisin as long as they don't consummate a marriage. The ein osin sudas erisin, the only limitation for erisin is to make a meal, a festive meal, but to have an active erisin performed during this time is perfectly okay. So the kasha is, you see from here that erisin is permitted before Tisha B'av, even the laundry is not permitted before Tisha B'av. So how then would we be so machmir to say that during shloshim, when she's allowed to do the laundry, as long as it's after Shiva, why then should we restrict her from getting erisin? So the Gemara answers, Kitan Yahi Kodem de Kodem. So the Gemara says, you don't understand the Brisa. The Brisa is not telling you that you're allowed to have erisin in the Shavua Shechalbo, in the week before Tisha B'av. It's telling you that you're allowed to have erisin in the week before the Shavua Shechalbo, in the week before the week that Tisha B'av falls out. But in the week that Tisha B'av falls out, you're also not allowed to have erisin. So Amar Rava v'kodim dekodim nami kal v'chomer. U'mabag makom she'asar lisa v'litein mutar li ares makom she'mutar lisa v'litein ein odin she'mutar li ares. But Rava says, but you haven't really solved the problem, because even if you're going to tell me that Erusin is permitted only the week before Shavua Shechalbo, but what does it say in that period when she's allowed to accept Erusin? You have to minimize your business activities. So even though the Avelus rises to a level where I have to minimize my business activities, but I'm still allowed to have Erusin, so surely during Shloshim, where there's no such requirement to limit business activities, surely Erusin should be permitted. So you're still back to your question. You're not asking the question of Kal V'chomer from laundry, so you're asking a question from Kal V'chomer from minimizing business. So the Gemara answers, you're right. So Rava says you have to modify Rabbi Yossi's statement. Now remember, the Mishnah in quoting Rabbi Yossi is quite clear. What does Rabbi Yossi say? Kol hanoshim yisarsu chutz min ha'almana. All women may accept Erusin after Nisuin, from the previous marriage, except and Almana can't accept Erusin because during the 30 days. But Rava says we have to reread that line. It doesn't mean all women can accept Erusin, but rather Kol Hanoshim Yinasu. But rather it means all women are allowed to accept Nisuin within the 3 months, except for an almana who's not allowed to have nisuin. And nisuin is something that everyone would agree that because of the mourning period you're not allowed to have, because you're not allowed to consummate a marriage in a period of mourning.
Is there no halacha to say that if you're going to restrict somebody, male a few days, male a week, but to restrict for a month is already too much? So to say you can't do laundry for a month, that's already tzifil, that's too much. So I don't know how much of a riot, how strong a right you can say, because during a 30-day period, you're allowed to do business. But you can't tell somebody you can't do business for a month. When people have lots, it's one thing, but if people are living hand to mouth, you can't say don't do business for a month. So I don't know that that's such a strong raya.
Well, the argument is that we're assuming that whatever is usher is equatable. In other words, if a person has to express some expression of mourning, so then these are expressions of mourning. Kibus is a greater, not laundering is a greater expression of mourning than having Erusin. And the fact that the proof is that you're not allowed to do laundry at the same time when you're allowed to have Erusin. So that's the argument. They're equatable as far as their level. I understand your argument. Your argument is that you can't expect a person to go without laundry for 30 days. Well, first of all, you can in the times of the Gemara, but barring that, even if that were true, but the very fact that the rabbis felt that doing laundry is a denial of mourning, then if they felt that strongly about Erusin, they would have made that same policy. But they don't. So you see that getting Erusin is not such a contradiction to mourning. And that's the argument. But in any event, what we're doing now is we're totally rereading Rabbi Yossi. And we're basically saying that Rav is doing this. He's saying that Rabbi Yossi is not saying that you're not allowed to have Erusin. You are allowed to have Erusin. You're just not allowed to have Nisuin. And therefore what Rabbi Yossi is saying is that all women are allowed to have Nisuin immediately after their first marriage, except if you're an almana. So the Gemara immediately jumps on this. He says, "V'lesle Rabbi Yossi lahavchin." Doesn't Rabbi Yossi require havchana to be able to tell who the father is? How can he tell me that you're allowed to get married immediately after your first marriage if you're not going to know who the father is in that case? What if she has a baby 7 months later? So the Gemara says, "Ibayis ema lesle." One answer could be that Taka Rabbi Yossi does not hold of this requirement of havchana, which is a very strange thing to say. My assumption is that it's not that Rabbi Yossi doesn't require havchana, but rather that Rabbi Yossi says, count how many days it took from the time of her marriage to her second husband for her to give birth. If it wasn't a full 9 months, so then you attribute it to the first husband. If it was more than 9 months from the divorce from her first husband, so then you know that it's from the second husband. In other words, he would tell you that it's enough to count the weeks of gestation of her pregnancy to be able to make that determination. That's one answer. The iba is ema la'olam islay, the ema Rabbi Yossi omer kol arusos grushos yinasu. Another answer could be is that Rabbi Yossi also requires havchana, and everyone would agree, including Rabbi Yossi, that if her first marriage was nisuin, then for sure she can't have nisuin right away. What he's talking about is that if a woman had erisin in her first marriage, and then she got divorced, then she's allowed to have full-blown nisuin afterwards, except if she was an almana from her erisin. That's where Rabbi Yossi is machmir, and he says that if you're an almana from erisin, and therefore you're in mourning, then you have to wait 30 days before you can have nisuin. So the Gemara says, Ihachi hainu Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara's question is, well, if that's the case, that Rabbi Yossi acknowledges and all he's basically saying is that when you had a erisin first, you're allowed to have nisuin right away. Rabbi Yehuda agrees with that also. Now maybe you could argue that Rabbi Yehuda would say in that case you can have nisuin right away, even though the woman's an almana. So the Gemara says, like Tosfos points out, he says that we assume that Rabbi Yehuda is not going to argue with Rabbi Yossi in that. Like Rashi said, like Tosfos says, he says, it seems like everyone would agree that we would not allow a woman to have nisuin while she's in her shloshim. Even Rabbi Yehuda would seemingly agree with that. The only machlokes we had thought originally was a question of erisin, that maybe Rabbi Yossi is more machmir. But now that you're telling me that you're reading Rabbi Yossi as saying that a woman is not allowed to have nisuin, then it would seem like there's no difference between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Everyone should agree to that. So that's our question. What's the difference then between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda now that you're telling me that Rabbi Yossi is talking about the prohibition of a woman having a nisuin after erisin when she's an almana, but when she's not an almana, she's allowed to have nisuin right away. So Ika Beinayu Nesua Li Ares. Rabbi Yehuda Savar Nesua Muteres Li Ares, Rabbi Yossi Savar Nesua Asur Li Ares. So the Gemara's answer is, I'll tell you what. The difference is not a case where her first marriage was erisin. There, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda are exactly the same. The machlokus is the opposite case, where their first marriage was nesuin, and now you want to do erisin. According to the way we're reading the Mishnah now, Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's mekel, and he says you can have erisin immediately after nesuin, and Rabbi Yossi is the one who's going to be machmir and say that no, you cannot have erisin after nesuin. You have to wait 3 months. And there's Rabbi Yossi is going to say there's a low plug, that whenever a first woman's marriage was nisuin, you have to always wait 3 months, regardless of what you want to do afterwards, whether it's erisin or nisuin. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to be the one who says no, just like you can have nisuin immediately after erisin, you can also have erisin immediately after nisuin. So now the Gemara's question is, this is a very convoluted reading of the Mishnah, but that's where we're holding right now. The Rabbi Yossi is only saying that you're allowed to have nisuin immediately after erisin, except in cases of widowhood. So the Gemara's question now is, V'savar Rabbi Yossi nesua asur li ares. You're now telling me that according to Rabbi Yossi, that a woman whose first marriage was nisuin is not allowed to have erisin right away. V'hatanya Rabbi Yossi Omer kol hanoshim yisarsu chutz min ha'almana. Look at the following brisa. Rabbi Yossi says that all women are allowed to have erisin right away, except for a widow. Mipnei ha'ibul, because of her widowship. V'kama ibul shalosh loshim, which is 30 days. V'kulan lo yinasu, and as far as nisuan, you have to wait 3 months. Shila and gimel chadashim. Okay, so hi mai. So the question is, what are you asking me from this brisa? Hi, my kusha. What's the question? Maybe you're telling me it's from the first part of the brisa that says that according to Rabbi Yossi, all women are allowed to have erisin right away. So you see that he's mekel just like Rabbi Yehuda. But the Gemara says, wait a minute. Mi alima mi masnisin du kimna ba'arusos grushos yinasu. Achanami kol arusos grushos yinasu. But remember, we totally manipulated the language of our own Mishnah. And we said that even though our Mishnah says that according to Rabbi Yossi, kol hanashim yisarsu, that all women are allowed to have immediate erisin, we said no, that's not how you read the Mishnah. He doesn't mean that. He means that all betrothed women, all women whose first marriage was erisin, are allowed to have nisuin right away. So if you're able to manipulate the language of the Mishnah that way, you can manipulate the language of the Brisa that way. He doesn't really mean to say that kol arusos, or that rather kol Kol Hanoshim Yisarsu, but rather any woman who had Erison in her first marriage is allowed to have Nisuin right away, as long as she was a Grusha and not an Almana. So Ela Miseifa, but rather it's from the Seifa of that Brisa, the Ketani, the Kulan Lo Yinasu Achulan Gimel Chadoshim. So it says in the last part of the Brisa that if a woman wants to have Nisuin, she has to wait 3 months. So what do you see from there? In Subehu Delo, Ha'itruse Shapir Dami. That implies that the only time that there's an absolute requirement of 3 months is when your woman wants to have Nisuin. But if she wants to have only Erison, it's mashma from this last part of the Brisa that she can have Erison right away. So again, our kasha is, how can you even suggest that according to Rabbi Yossi, you're not allowed to have Erison right away? So Amar Rava Tritz ve'emahachi. So Rava again, he's the one who's coming up with this whole new reading. He says you have to read it like this: Rabbi Yossi Omer Kol Arusos Grushos Yinasu Chutz Min Ha'almana, that any woman who had Erison is allowed to have Nisuin right away unless she was widowed. Mipnei ha'ibel v'kama ibel shalash shloshim yom. And how much is her mourning period if she's a widow? 30 days. And the last part is unasuos lo yisarsu ad shilan shlosha chadoshim. That the last part of the brisa, which says that a woman is allowed to have nisuin after 3 months period, no, that's not the way you read it. But we're going to manipulate that again. We're talking about a woman whose first marriage was nisuin, and she's only allowed to have erison after 3 months. That's the way you reread the entire brisa. The almana min ha'erison. Okay, period. So basically, Rava is forced to completely manipulate and reread the entire Mishnah and the entire Brisa in order for it to make sense in his understanding of Rabbi Yossi. So just to review, according to Rava, for Rabbi Yossi, it's a woman is allowed to have Nisuin immediately after Erison unless she's an Almana, right? But as far as Erison, Rabbi Yossi is Machmir, and he says if her first marriage was Nisuin, you have to always wait 3 months in order to have Erison. So the Gemara says, "V'almana min ha'erison mi isla ibel." So wait a minute, Rabbi Yossi. According to you, so what are you saying? You're reading our Mishnah that says if her first marriage was Erison, then she's allowed to have Nisuin right away, except if she's an Almana. If she's an Almana, there's 30 days of mourning. Since when does a woman have to mourn a man that she only had Erison with? That's not even the halacha. Because Vahatani Rabbi Chia bar Ami Ishto Arusa lo onin velo mitame la v'chein hi lo onenas velo mitama alo. That if a man and a woman only had Erison together, he does not mourn for her, she does not mourn for him, he's not mitame for her, she's not mitame for him, and Mesa eno yorsha mesu gova ksuvasa. And if she dies, he does not inherit her, and if he dies, then in a situation where he voluntarily offered her the ksuva after Erison, then she can collect her ksuva. But you see that there's no mourning. So how could you even read it that way, that she's got a 30-day required waiting period after Erison in order to have new nisuin? There's no such din of avelus after Erison. So Ella Tanoihi. So the Gemara says, you're right. Rava, sorry. No matter how much you try to reread the Mishnah and the Brisa, it's not going to work. So the answer is like this. What was our original question? We have a Mishnah in Maseches Tainus which says that Erison during Avelus is not a problem, right? Because if it's not a problem during a time when doing laundry is usher, then surely it should not be a problem when laundry is mutter, or when business is mutter. So the Gemara's answer is, guess what? It's machlokas tanoim. That there are some tanoim who hold that during periods of mourning, Erison is usher. And I'll show you the Tanya Merosh Chodesh ve'ad hatainis ha'am mema'atin me'iskein me'lisa u'me'litain me'livnos v'lintoa u'me'li'ares u'me'lisa. That this brisa says that from Rosh Chodesh Av through Tisha B'Av, you have to minimize business. You're not allowed to plant. You're not allowed to build. You're not allowed to betroth, and you're not allowed to have nisuin. So you see, according to this brisa, Erison is usher during a period of mourning, and that's how Rabbi Yossi is learning. And then it says, Shabbos shechal Tisha B'Av b'socho asu l'saper l'chabes. Then, when the mourning intensifies in the Shavua Shechalbo, the week that Tisha B'Av falls out, in addition to the stuff you can't do for Rosh Chodesh, you're also not allowed to get haircuts and do laundry. And v'yesh omrim kol hachodesh usher. And some say that the entire month you're not allowed to engage in these activities. So, Rav Ashi is going to challenge this. Maskef la Rav Ashi, mimai deli ares li ares mamish, doma lemi abed sudas erisin huda aser hali ares shaper dami. So how do you know that this brisa is asering erisin? Maybe the word li ares simply means to make a su'uda, to make a festive meal. But maybe the act of erisin itself, just to give her the ring and to say Aryai mekudeshesli, is not a big deal. You're allowed to do that during, maybe the brisa permits that. So once again, you're back to the problem of why shouldn't she be allowed to accept erisin during shloshim? So the Gemara's answer is, ihachi milisa linase nami liavesudas nisun huda aser halisa shapir dami. So the Gemara says, what are you suggesting? That brisa said that during the period of mourning, you're not supposed to have erisin, and you're not supposed to have nisuin. If you're telling me that the word erisin means making a festive meal for the erisin, so what are you going to tell me? Nisuin means only prohibiting having a festive meal for the nisuin? So it means a guy's allowed to consummate his marriage during a mourning period, right? That doesn't make any sense. So the Gemara says, no, it does, because hachi hashta bishlam nisuin below suda ika simcha, ela erisin below suda mi ika simcha. The Gemara says, no, I'm sorry, you are allowed to make that distinction, because I can understand nisuin, when it says don't have nisuin during the mourning period, it means don't have the actual act of nisuin, because the act of consummating a marriage brings a man simcha, right? Hopefully it brings the woman simcha too, but the man for sure, right? But erisin without the festive meal, where's the simcha there? As someone mentioned to me this morning, the reason I make the difference, because a woman's going to be thrilled that she's got the ring on her finger. You should have put a ring on it, right? Isn't that the song, the way the song goes, right? But she's thrilled when she gets her ring, right? But the Gemara's point is, from the man's standpoint, there's no real simcha in just getting engaged and just having erisin, right? So therefore, the only thing that this is Rav Ashi's argument, the only thing that the brisa could mean when it prohibits erisin is the meal. But when it prohibits nisuin, it could be referring to the nisuin, the act, the consummation itself. And therefore, says Rav Ashi, you have no proof that erisin itself is usher during the period of mourning before Tisha B'Av. So Ela Amar Rav Ashi, so you want to know the real answer, says Rav Ashi, why it's not a stira, why you're allowed to have erisin during the mourning period before Tisha B'Av, but you're not allowed to have erisin during a woman's period of widowhood during her shloshim. He says, Shiny avelus chadasha me'avelus yeshana v'shiny avelus derabba me'avelus deyachid. There's two different types of avelus. One is a national mourning for a historical event, and the other one is a personal mourning for a recent death in one's immediate family. And those two are reflective of two different expressions of mourning. This is such an important statement of fact in the Gemara that it has ramifications in halacha as well. But the way Tosfos Rabbeinu Tam is explaining it, he says like this: it's one thing to tell me that if a woman just was widowed from her husband, we're not going to allow her to have erisin, because that's actually going to cause her to break away from her bereavement over the loss of her husband, and that's what we don't allow. But when it comes to national mourning over the Churban, having erisin is not an immediate opposition to the sense of national mourning over the event that happened many centuries ago. And by contrast, let's talk about business activity. Business activity for a woman who just lost her husband is permitted during shloshim, because business activity is not a reflection of my ignorance of my husband's passing. If anything, the fact that I have to go to work now only reminds me, accentuates the fact that my husband has passed away. Whereas by national mourning, by my going to work every day and engaging in business affairs as normal, it doesn't look right as far as my being a part of the Jewish people who have to collectively express the fact that we are bereaved over the loss of our temple. And therefore, from a collective communal response to the Churban, we all have to, as a community, minimize the amount of work that we do. Let's finish off, and so it's a beautiful teretz. I think it's a very elegant teretz that Rav Ashi is explaining. The Mishnah now says these are all dvarim pshutim that we've learned all along in Maseches Yevamos. Arba achem nesuin arba anashim Umesu imratzu hagadol shabem liyabim eskulam harishus biyado. All the Mishnah here is telling me is that even if you have multiple brothers that pass away, there's no requirement to share in the responsibility of Yibum with the surviving brothers. Meaning that if the oldest surviving brother wants to do Yibum with all of the women, he has that right. Right? If, let's say, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi pass away and all there's left is Yehuda, but Yehuda has younger brothers, Yisachar, Zvulun, etc., Yehuda can say, I'm going to marry all three of them. I'll do Yibum with all three of them. He doesn't have to sort of share the responsibility with Yisachar and Zvulun. And Misha hayanasu lishtei nashim umeis biyaso chalitzas shalechas men poteres sarasa. The next thing that we learned, which was very clear from all of the previous Gemaras, is actually, I have a little shtickle tzarachi, and why the Mishnayos wait until here to tell us this. It's something that we needed to know before, which is that once you do Yibum Chalitza to one of the co-wives, if a man dies leaving multiple wives, so then you do Yibum Chalitza to one, and that lets everyone else off the hook, because Kevin Shabana, Shuv Lo Yivna, once you've already done proactively with one wife, then all of the other women are off the hook. This we saw also. Let's say a man dies and leaves over two wives. One is a divorcee from a previous marriage, and one was a virgin when he married her. And now she's an almana. Okay? So one of these women, therefore, is puzzled to marry a Kohen, and the other one is allowed to marry a Kohen. So imhaya choletz lepesula, imhaya miyabim lekeshera. And all the Mishnah tells us is that if you're going to do chalitza with the woman who already is puzzled to marry a Kohen. And the reason for this is, the analogy that the Gemara made was, don't spill out your well water just because you don't need it, because someone else may need it. And the analogy being is that don't do chalitza to a woman who's right now, before you do chalitza, perfectly fit for a Kohen, because maybe she'll want to marry a Kohen in the future. Why create sort of like a gratuitous disposal of her ability to marry a Kohen if you can do chalitza just as easily with the other one who already is puzzled to the Kohen? That's what the Mishnah is teaching us. And if you want to do Yibum, then you can do Yibum to whichever one you want. Have a wonderful day.